Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
LaPierre waiting out behind the net. Moved it to the wall. Then Edmundson scores! Joel Edmundson.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings.
Defensive zone face-off. Pretty big one here 15 seconds ago. And it's one cleanly by Drouin. Now Edmundson, he scores! Joel Edmundson.
Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
Welcome back, Kings fans. I am Jesse Cohen. This is All the Kings Men. We're continuing our series of acquisition evaluations. Today we're talking about Joel Edmundson. Joel Edmundson was signed to a 4-year contract with an average annual value of $3.85 million. Edmundson is listed at 6'5", 221 pounds. He was a second-round pick, 46th overall in the 2011 NHL entry draft, and won the Stanley Cup with the St. Louis Blues in the 2018-2019 season. Mike Vogel, Ed Egros, and Arpon Basu joined me to discuss the free agent signing. Heads up, however, about 10 minutes into my conversation with Arpon, his phone overheated, we lost our connection, and that was the end of the discussion, but some good insight, I thought. We'll have another conversation with Mike Vogel later this week as we get his thoughts on Darcy Kemper. Then next Monday, we're diving into our post-draft conversations with Mark Yannetti as we'll look at the 4 players taken in the 2024 NHL entry draft. Hope you enjoy it. Joining me today, Mike Vogel, senior writer, WashingtonCaps.com. How are you doing today, Mike?
Doing good, Jesse. How about you?
I'm excellent. Still excellent. Taking the curtain back as always. This is about 30 seconds after our previous conversation. So not much has changed in that regard. Joel Edmundson signed with the LA Kings day one of free agency. He spent about, 3/4, half a season with the Washington Capitals last year. He is a big defenseman. I don't know if you've seen the Steve Dangle segment where they talked about that trade for Joel Edmundson and Pierre-Luc Dubois, but one of the things that they mentioned on it that I actually thought was a unique interpretation of the move and one I had not considered. They essentially said there's 2 ways to make your team better. One is to invest in draft and free agency and spend time in NHL currency and get players that will outperform your opponent. That's the long-term, expensive, difficult, no guarantee way to do it. The other way to do it is to go out and get someone who's going to hurt your opponent. Not hurt as an injure, but someone who's going to inflict their will on your opponent, make them think twice about going in the corners, make them reluctant to play physical as the game goes on because they're going to wear you down. And they identified Joel Edmundson as one of those players. Does that match the player that you saw during his time in Washington?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Joel Edmundson's a guy that goaltenders love to have playing in front of him. He's a guy who plays a real hard-nosed game. And, one of his nicknames, Steady Eddie, I think also applies here. For me, and I only saw Joel night in and night out for, like you said, about 3/4 of a season. And he missed, I'd say, the first 6 or 8 weeks of the season as well. He got hurt in the first preseason game. We didn't see him for a while after that. And actually, I don't even know if it was the first. It was on the day of the first preseason game. He may have been practicing that day. I don't recall if it was a practice injury or the first preseason game. But he was out from late September until I would say mid-November. But when he jumped into the lineup, yeah, he was fun to watch because he keeps guys honest in the corners and in the front of the net. Very hard-nosed, absolute willingness to lay out in front of shots, do the dirty work, the things that are necessary, the details of the game that you got to have over a full 60 minutes if you want to win. Really good penalty killer. He's a guy that you can deploy against, as a shutdown type of defenseman. I think there was a time in his career where he was a top 4 guy. For me, I think he's more of a third pair guy now, but he's really good at what he does. He understands his role and he plays it to a T. And he's a really good teammate too. Our guys really liked having him around. Also, I think he's not an offensive defenseman by any means, but
no, he's not.
His instincts are not that bad offensively, and you saw a little bit of it in the playoffs this year. There's a couple of times where he found himself a little bit of time and space in the ozone. I wouldn't say he's a scoring threat or anything, but he, if he winds up with I've seen him make a couple of plays. That's all. He's not completely bereft of offensive skills, but he knows where his bread is buttered, and he concentrates on that part of the game, and he's quite good at it. And you look at his career, he's a Stanley Cup winner, played in the finals with Montreal. I think the one thing about Joel that stands out is the way he plays the game. It's going to be hard for him to play, a good chunk of the 82 in any given year. And that shows up in his NHL resume. He's been nicked up a lot, missed chunks of time and everything, but that's just the way he is and the style that he plays.
I think going into the season, the Kings have 10 left shot defensemen available to them. So
how many righties?
5, I want to say.
Okay. So
it used to be flipped. We used to have way too many right shot defensemen and not enough left.
We're happy to have Matt Roy here.
Well, so funny you should mention that, because his nickname in LA was Steady Eddie. But he played the right side and played up a pair from what I think most people expect Joel Edmundson will. I've seen quotes from him about, as you said, he's not interested in playing offense. He's interested in playing defense so his offensive partner can play offense. We don't know yet who he will be paired with in LA, but it's likely either going to be Brandt Clarke or Jordan Spence, or if something terribly wrong happens, maybe Riley Walsh or I'm blanking on Burrow's first name. But is he the type of, in a perfect world, I think a lot of people see a lefty and a righty paired. One of them plays defensive, one of them plays, up in the ice. Is his game the kind that complements a more offensively minded partner?
Yeah, I could see that, like sort of in the Matty Nordstrom, Rob Blake vein. I mean, on a lesser extent. I don't think any of the guys you mentioned are Rob Blake that are going to be his partners, and he's no Matty Nordstrom. But yeah, I think along those lines, he absolutely can do that. Sort of mind the storm, make sure that he's got such a good wingspan too. He's a big, tall guy. He handles 2-on-1s well when they happen. Is usually not responsible for them when they happen, because he's not real aggressive at pinching. He knows when to pick his spots, and he knows his limitations too. I think for me, he's more a cerebral defenseman than a lot of guys too, just because I think he's been around long enough to understand what he can get away with and when he needs to kind of pull back. So yeah, I do think he would make a good partner for an offensive minded right-handed defenseman. And yeah, that would be, I think, the ideal pairing.
Personality wise, like I said, he's likely to pair with Spence or Clarke. Clarke, I want to say, is 20. Spence might be 22 or 23. I'd have to check, but they're both very young in their careers. If Clarke lasts a full season, it'll be his first full season in the NHL.
Yeah.
It'll be Jordan Spence's second full season. I don't think that either of those two guys are lacking in confidence or need an emotional babysitter, but is Joel Edmundson the type of guy who can skate up to a younger teammate if play goes wrong or sideways on them and tell them, hey, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Just stay in the game.
Yeah, I think Joel's got a really good bedside manner in situations like that. I think he'd be a great mentor for an up-and-coming young defenseman, honestly. Because, people, now that he's been in the league for a really long time, people forget that he was a second-round draft pick. He had some pedigree coming out of junior, and he's had a really good career. And I think had he been healthier, he probably would have an even more impressive career. But I do think that like I said earlier, he's a really good teammate. I think he would absolutely be a good mentor for a younger up and coming defenseman. And I don't think he's the kind of guy that's going to yell and scream or embarrass a guy in front of his teammates or on the bench. I think he would quietly pull him aside in the room, away from the prying eyes of cameras or 18,000 spectators, and just have a good conversation with him about, hey, this is what we can do better out there, and I got your back, and all that kind of stuff. I think, again, from my experience with him, which was only the one season, just an absolute gem of a teammate and a really good human. I think guys enjoyed having him around a lot, and I think he's that for me, that's one of the great things about our game is that you see it all the time. Guys are willing to push guys up, try to lift all the boats, even if it means maybe helping the guy who's going to take your job eventually. And I think it's one of the selfless things that happens in the NHL. And it doesn't, there are some guys who are balky about that. And really, I'm not letting this guy take my job. But I do think there are a lot of guys too that realize that, hey, my time is growing short here in this game. I'm more on the back nine than the front, but this kid's got a future in front of him, and I want to show him the ropes and let him know the little perils that are to be found along the way, shift by shift, game by game, all that kind of stuff. And I think there's immense value too in having that veteran defenseman. I can't tell you how transformative it was to have Brooks Orpik on the Capitals for 5 years. And I don't think they win that 2018 Stanley Cup without him. He changed so much in the locker room and was such a wise mentor to so many guys about how to prepare for games and how to balance your battle level over the course of 82 games and to stay fresh and to be hard when you need to be hard. And I think so many guys learned so many elements of the game from Brooks. And I see Eddie as a guy who can impart that kind of wisdom to players as well.
Reputation and identity is such a funny thing in hockey. We underrate guys, then they go to a different team in a different role, they play well, then we overrate them. I'm thinking specifically of guys like Oliver Ekman-Larsson or Luke Shen, where at different stops in their career, it was
Tyler
like,
Myers.
Yes, or even Brooks Orpik, I guess, to a lesser extent, where you look at them in one role and you go, this is going to be the key to what we need. It's not. And so you say, oh, well, then that guy's a bum. His value plummets. He bounces around to 2 or 3 different teams. Then he winds up winning a Stanley Cup on a different team in a totally different role. And then suddenly it's like the fog is lifted. You're like, oh my God, this guy's actually good. And it's like, well, was he ever actually bad, or did we just put him in a different role? Joel Edmundson won the Stanley Cup in 2019 with the St. Louis Blues on that incredible run.
Yeah.
Then he went to Montreal, and I feel like he got this oversized reputation maybe for what he's capable of delivering. Not his fault.
Right.
But it sounds like he's an excellent third pair option.
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I think if again, I think he probably got second paired money.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think he's a really good third pair guy, and I think too, Jesse, that for me, the time that I've been covering the Caps and covering the NHL, I feel like every city, every team has a whipping boy, a guy that the fans, for whatever reason, I mean, this guy could be, those of us who watch the guys 82 games night in and night out, you see the value in some of the, especially players like Joel Edmundson, the guy that we had here who actually finished his career in LA. Jeff Schultz was that guy here in Washington for a number of years. You'd watch him play, and he was nothing flashy, but he was effective, and he was Mike Green's partner, and that goes back to kind of what we were talking about with having an offensive guy and a defensive guy, and they were a very effective tandem for a number of years here. But fans just never latched on to him. They thought, because he was so big, he should have been more physical. Some guys aren't cut out that way. But he was very effective, and you could see that if you watched him night in and night out. I just think that for whatever reason in our game, every team seems to have its whipping boy among the fan base, and I would say 90 or more % of the time, in whichever of the 32 cities we're talking about, it's not justified.
Sometimes it is. I just want to throw that out there.
Sometimes the other 10% it is.
Yeah,
but
we've had this conversation with John Hoven a number of times where he says, I don't understand how the fans get together and all decide it's the same guy.
Yeah.
And some seasons I just shrug and go, well, they watch the games. But yeah, oftentimes it is a mystery. Mike Vogel, thank you so much for your time. One of my favorites to talk with. We got to get you on sometime and just, I don't know, we can talk about.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know. Best hockey movie of all time, Jesse, or something. Yeah. Mike, Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your summer.
My pleasure. You too. Good to see you.
Joining me once again from Bally Sports West, Ed Egros. How are you doing today, Ed?
Is it really mid-July right now?
Yes, it is. And this is my favorite trick to pull, and I've done it a bajillion times at this point. But every time you'll hear me talking to Ed Egros this summer, it's all being recorded on the same day. So every time I ask him how he's doing, we're just struggling to find ways to say the exact same thing. And we're here today. 15
on
minutes
this
after,
day.
Yes. 15 minutes after we talked about Tanner Jeannot. We're here to talk about Joel Edmundson. Now, I'm just going to be perfectly candid here. The public response to the Joel Edmundson acquisition by the LA Kings independent fan media and, social media chorus is overwhelmingly negative. And a lot of it has to do with his age, the length of the contract, the term on the contract. I spoke to Mike Vogel from WashingtonCaps.com, and conversation, I think people will have heard it just now before they hear this conversation, so they'll know what I'm talking about. Overwhelmingly positive. Couldn't have more nice things to say about Joel Edmundson as a player, as a person, as a teammate. My inclination in life is to be skeptical and maybe perhaps pessimistic, according to some people. I prefer skeptical to pessimistic. As the summer goes on, we're middle of July now, all of my concerns are beginning to be slowly erased by my urge to want to see the Kings do well. And so I find myself in a position where it's very easy to talk me into things. Like, last year when the Kings acquired Pierre-Luc Dubois, I did not think it was a good idea. By the time the season had started, I had talked myself into the position of, well, if everything works out, this is a contending team. Mm-hmm. I stayed with the caveat of most things don't always work out. Right. And they didn't. And so I wasn't terribly surprised. But at the start of the season, I was wanting things to work out. I'm always wanting the Kings to succeed, right? I would rather be wrong about any reservations I ever have about any move the Kings ever make. I'd rather be wrong and have them win the Stanley Cup. In 2014, Jeff Carter got hurt, and I was like, well, call it, season's done, cash it in, tank the season, who cares? I was wrong. They went on to win the Stanley Cup. I don't care that I was wrong. People can laugh at me for the rest of my life about being wrong about that in 2014. Pumpernickel continues to do so. Don't care. Stanley Cup. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, rather win the Stanley Cup than be right.
Your predictions are not banners that hang in the rafters.
Nope. Exactly. Although it's a good idea for my office. But so what can you tell us about Joel Edmundson, not from a watching and play standpoint, but just from an analytical standpoint?
For sure. So left-handed shot, certainly is kind of part of the deal, I guess. Top shot speed of 98 miles per hour ranks in greater than the 90th percentile. And to me, this matters a great deal because when we're talking about the slap shot, I know we've had this conversation before about how basically it's going out of style. We're seeing it less and less often in today's NHL. And that's in large part because defenses are really, really good and they can sort of prevent anyone from having the space to get a slap shot off. It's also better if, say, you're closer to the net in terms of increasing your probability of getting a goal. So the fact that you may have a rather fast slap shot, what are the situations in which that might matter? Well, the biggest one is on the power play. And that's when we tend to see more one-timers than any other context. And so right away, this seemed to me like an acquisition where because, offensively, the Kings have some retooling to do, this could very well be a defenseman. Yes, he has a big frame, and you certainly like that. But this may also be someone who, even though he wasn't much of a special teamer this past season, the year prior with Montreal, he and David Savard spent a lot of time on the penalty kill. So I look at someone who, he's logged a lot of minutes in terms of, being 4-on-5, but he could also be a 5-on-4 prospect because that shot is so fast. And even though, say, that penalty kill in Montreal wasn't a good overall unit, sometimes just learning on the job is the best thing that you can do. But again, you go back to that frame of 6'5", it should shut down would-be puck handlers. Lots of cross-checking penalties called, so that may be a bit of a concern. But again, it goes back to something that I know we've talked about a lot in terms of these acquisitions, and that is this notion of a more physical brand of hockey. And certainly that's going to be part of that cultural revolution, so to speak, that the Kings are hoping to employ this offseason.
There was a clip, I've referenced it a number of times at this point now, but there was a segment from the Steve Dangle podcast where Steve Dangle, and I'm blanking on his two co-hosts' names, apologies, gentlemen, but they're talking about the moves that the Kings made and the acquisition of Joel Edmundson. And they talk about there being two primary ways to impact your opponent. One is to get better, which requires draft capital. Free agency is expensive. It's hard. It's long. The other way is to just get somebody who hurts your opponent. Mm-hmm. And then they mentioned Joel Edmundson. They mentioned the cross-checking, the physicality, etc. So we talked about Tanner Jeannot, about his penalties, about how that might impact special teams play, going both ways. Joel Edmundson, I think, is probably likely to spend more time on the penalty kill than on the power play, just based on a million different factors. But even so, I don't necessarily know how much time he'll spend even on the penalty kill, but you did mention penalties. So anything leaps out to you from that standpoint? Because Joel Edmundson doesn't take a ton of penalties.
No, he doesn't. And even though there's certainly, aspects of his game where it would require sort of a disciplined approach, at the same time, there is a lot to like when it comes to, that brand that the Kings are hoping to get, and this is something we talked about with Jeannot, but I think it bears repeating here. And that is that even though the Kings had a lot of penalty minutes incurred this past season, a lot of the guys who were responsible for, say, those 2-minute minors aren't there now. And so that gives the Kings some added wiggle room to where, okay, penalties are going to happen, but at least perhaps we can be a little bit smarter about it. And you've got someone with a good head on his shoulders in Edmundson who may be able to, only take them when absolutely necessary. And say if he's not in the box, but he's on the penalty kill, then he's certainly someone who, can challenge would-be puck handlers, be able to clear the puck, and, prevent any kind of offensive opportunity to exist.
Well, he is definitely what was the phrase you used?
A cultural revolution.
Yes, a cultural revolution. That is definitely the catchphrase for the summer, with the Kings bringing in a lot of truculence in the offseason. Ed Egros, you are never truculent with us. We always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Joining me today, writer for The Athletic, Arpon Basu. How are you doing today, Arpon?
I'm good, Jesse. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you. We're here to talk about Joel Edmundson, and apologies to my listeners who have likely heard me reference this already 5 or 6 times, but I was watching the Steve Dangle podcast, and they were reacting to the Kings acquisition of Joel Edmundson, and I think I don't remember if it was Steve Dangle or one of his co-hosts, but one of them said there's 2 ways to improve your team. One is to get better players who can do things that nobody else can do, but that requires draft capital, free agency. It's expensive. It takes a while. The other way is to get guys that make your opponents worse. And they highlighted Joel Edmundson as fitting that category through his physicality, his cross-checking specifically. He will wear down an opponent. His presence will cause them to alter the way they play. Does that sound like the kind of player you're familiar with based on his time in Montreal?
Yeah, very much so. And it's really why that when a player like Joel Edmundson faces the same opponent 4, 5, 6, 7 times in a row, he takes a toll on his opponents, and he's really made for that type of hockey. So, I think there's going to be moments during the regular season. There always are when it comes to him, where you're thinking, well, this is less than ideal. He's not the fastest guy. In fact, he's pretty slow. Not the most nimble guy, and he's not exactly great at, exiting the zone with control and certain things, that you kind of look for in a defenseman, but he has qualities that are very beneficial to whatever team he's playing on in the playoffs. And that's why Montreal acquired him. That's why Washington acquired him. That's why Toronto acquired him. And that's why I would imagine the Los Angeles Kings signed him to the contract that they did.
I'm glad that you mentioned the length of a playoff series, because I've had this disagreement with Ken Belke from Sinbin out in Vegas a number of times. He says there's no difference between regular season hockey and playoff hockey. He thinks it's stupid when people call playoff hockey a different sport. I'm one of those people that he thinks is stupid. I think playoff hockey is a completely different sport.
Yeah,
but one of the reasons that
I would also be stupid in his eyes.
He's a very opinionated guy. He's a good guy. We like Ken, even though he pulls for the wrong team. But one thing that never comes up in those discussions, right? Obviously, people talk about the whistles being put away, the physicality increasing. But I think less discussed is what you just mentioned, which is that you're playing the same opponent multiple times. So your coaching staff has an opportunity to adjust. Your goaltending has an opportunity to adjust. And your opponent has to compensate for the things that you're doing night in and night out. And if Joel Edmundson can make a guy change his game from period 1 to period 3 of one game, surely he makes them change their game from game 1 to game 3 of a best of 7 series.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the year the Canadians made the final in 2021, they faced, obviously that was a wonky COVID year, the division realignment and everything. So Montreal was playing in the All Canadian division, and obviously had like these series, and it was a different season, and really doesn't count in the grand scheme of things in terms of, predictive value, but a 7-game series is still a 7-game series. Canadians faced the Maple Leafs in the first round, and as that series wore on, Mitch Marner, Austin Matthews, their big guns became progressively less and less effective, dangerous. They had second thoughts going on into certain areas of the ice. They took a lot of abuse. There was a lot of clamoring from out of Toronto during that series about how the refereeing is being handled in that series. It wasn't only Edmundson. They had Ben Sherratt on that team. They had Shea Weber on that team. 3 guys who take certain liberties when the officiating adjusts somewhat in the playoffs, which it invariably does, even though everyone says it doesn't. So the cross-checking, things like that. After a while, when that doesn't get called consistently, players are going to know what's waiting for them when they enter certain areas of the ice, or when they're battling for pucks along the wall and things like that. And that's where Joel Edmundson really thrives. And he has a really good understanding of where that line is. And he goes right up against that line and doesn't generally go over it too often, which is a real skill. That's a talent into itself. So, understanding that and just, having a good comprehension of how far you can go without going over the line and putting your team in trouble penalty wise, is valuable. And he's a great penalty killer as well, which also has value. So, and obviously the Kings, Marc Bergevin's in the Kings front office. He was the general manager of that team in 2021 in Montreal. It's not hard to make a link between that experience that he had. He's the one who acquired him to begin with for the Canadians. It's not hard to see that link when Joel Edmundson got the contract that he did.
I don't know how much one-on-one interaction you had with Joel, but what type of person is he in the locker room, off the ice, around his teammates?
Yeah, I had a fair bit, and yeah, he's extremely well liked. He's a benefit to a locker room culture, and he kind of quickly took that on. It's funny actually, because so his role in St. Louis was he was the locker room DJ.
Okay.
He took care of the music. He took that role on from Kevin Shattenkirk. We did. My colleague Julian McKenzie, who now covers the Flames, but he was in Montreal for a while. He did a big story on just how he manages the music. That was a big thing when he left Montreal, was who's going to take care of the music. And that's just like kind of a quirky example of how he leads in the room. He kind of socially makes sure that guys are involved. When Jordan Harris, for instance, finished his career at Northeastern, joined the Canadiens towards the end of the season, arrived in South Florida where the Canadiens were playing the Panthers relatively late in the evening. And the guy who was waiting for him in the hotel lobby to take him out to dinner was Joel Edmundson. So that's kind of the things that he does. It was kind of funny when he was in Washington and came through Montreal. I asked him if he had taken over DJ responsibilities in Washington. He said, no, not yet. They kind of had, I don't know who it was, but they had sort of an established guy, and it seemed to make him a little sad. So if the Kings don't have that guy, they've acquired a good locker room DJ in Joel Edmundson.
I think the duties were split between Pierre-Luc Dubois and Vladislav Gavrikov last season. So Dubois longer with the team.
There's a position available there.
Yeah. And if his musical taste fits in better, who knows? Did you get any sense of what he was like with the fans, or the media? The Montreal, obviously a much different market than LA when it comes to hockey players.
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, he's not a modern defenseman. He's very much an old school, traditional defensive shutdown defenseman who uses his physicality. He's a really big body. He has an excellent understanding of defensive zone play. Like it's really, he has a lot of attributes, but those attributes are not associated with the modern game and the way you look at modern defensemen, So the Kings didn't get themselves a puck mover, they got themselves a stopper. And my only question in the whole thing is, at that term, Joel Edmondson's had back issues. He's had trouble staying healthy. I mean, that's the only real question mark I have about the signing is he going to be able to play out that contract? Is he going to be healthy enough to do it? But for a team that's struggled to get out of the first round of the playoffs, this is the type of guy that can help you do that. I mean, that's just the reality. And the unrestricted free agent market is what it is. And sometimes you have to overpay either on term or on money, to get the guy that you think you need. And, I think when the Kings get to a playoff series situation and you watch this guy have an impact, that accumulates over the course of a series, I think fans will start to understand why the Kings were so interested in him. It's just a matter of whether he's going to get it to 4 years or not.
There was a moment in the press conference announcing Jim Hiller as the new head coach of the LA Kings. They removed the interim tag. Rob Blake talked about the desire to win needing to be raised within the group. Then he went on to talk about, on the offensive side, needing to get in the goalie's face a little bit more, crashing the net a little bit more. And on the defensive end, the need to actually get in shooting lanes, block shots, not just make it look like you are and have the puck miss you by 6 inches. It sounds like Joel Edmundson is the type. I mean, everybody here knows it. It's Burrows, it's Jeannot, it's Edmundson. Like, the team has very clearly made an investment in improving that element of the game. It sounds like Joel Edmundson is a solid investment towards that goal.
Oh yeah, I mean, shot block. He does not half-heartedly block shots. He gets in the way, puts himself in harm's way, with no question.
And that is where Arpon's phone overheated. Apologies, because it sounded like we were about to get some more interesting insight to the defensive side of Joel Edmondson's game. Hope you enjoyed this look at Joel Edmundson. As I mentioned in the intro, on Thursday we'll be talking to Mike Vogel about Darcy Kemper. Then next week we'll get into the draft picks. And I got to tell you, some really good conversations. Pre-recorded a lot of them. We're not totally done yet, but some good stuff in there. I think you'll really like it. Thanks for listening.